Good morning. My name is Daniel Benjamin. I'm the president of the American Academy in Berlin, and I want to thank you all for joining us today for this special event with Naomi Kikoler entitled China and the Uyghurs, the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum's Assessment of Mass Atrocities in Xinjiang. I want to begin by thanking my friend Christoph Markschies, the president of the Berlin-Brandenburgische Akademie der Wissenschaften, for hosting us here in the Einstein Hall. And when you think of Einstein as not only the greatest physicist of the last 150 years, but also one of the great humanitarians, it seems like a very appropriate place to be. So the world is, as we all know, awash with extraordinary mind-bending challenges. Russia's brutal invasion of Ukraine is the one dominating the headlines, but no less vexing is the rise of China. And within the constellation of issues that we face in dealing with China is its blatant disregard for the fundamental human rights of its people, and even worse, the persecution of its Muslim minority Uyghurs in Xinjiang province. Millions of people in detention, torture, sexual abuse, forced reduction of birth rates. These practices, which have come to light in the last 5 years, have shocked the conscience of so many in the international community. It is therefore appropriate that we discuss this, and it is, of course, timely as well in light of the Chancellor's recent trip to China, the upcoming summits at the G20 and at APEC, and the continuing roiling discussion of China. I'm particularly pleased that Naomi Kikoler could come and join us to do this briefing, because one of the milestones in the understanding of what was going on in China was the report produced by the Simon Skote Center at the Holocaust Museum, which Naomi is the director of. That report, entitled now I've forgotten the title of the report, Naomi. Watching Us Disappear? Yes. Watching Us Slowly Disappear, the Chinese government's assault on the Uyghur people in Xinjiang came out exactly a year ago, and made a significant stir in the public understanding of the problem, and was really an important landmark in this discussion, precisely because of the Simon Skote Center's stellar reputation as an objective observer and a watchdog on issues of mass atrocity and genocide. So, as I mentioned, Naomi is the director of the Simon Skote Center for the Prevention of Genocide. She has been in that job for about 3.5 years. Before that, she was the deputy director. She has overseen many of the reports that the Holocaust Museum has put out relating to mass atrocities around the world. It's worth noting that when the Holocaust Museum was founded, it was done so with an idea not only to educating the public and preventing genocides in the future, but also being a public voice against mass atrocities. Before Naomi came to the Simon Skote Center, she was at the Global Center for the Responsibility to Protect, R2P, beginning in 2008, where she led the center's work on populations at risk, and also led the center's advocacy work. Among the many reports that Naomi has produced for the Holocaust Memorial Museum, Our Generation Is Gone, the Islamic State's Targeting of Minorities in Nineveh, the 2011 report, Risk Factors and Legal Norms Associated with Genocide Prevention, which was done for the UN Office on the Prevention of Genocide and the Jacob Blaustein Institute. Naomi, we've been trying to get you here for a while. There was this pandemic that intervened. I couldn't be happier that you're here now. Thank you so much for being with us. There will be a panel discussion afterwards. I will introduce our panelists then.
Thank you so much, Dan. It is a real honor to finally be here with all of you and to be here on behalf of the Simon Scott Center for the Prevention of Genocide at the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum. I'd like to thank the American Academy and the Berlin Brandenburg Academy of Sciences. As Dan mentioned, we're here to discuss really one of the most vexing issues of our time. And we're here gathered at a really unique moment. For an organization such as ourselves, this is especially true. We were created to try to do for communities today what was not done for the Jews of Europe during the Holocaust, to raise early warning of threats facing vulnerable communities, to urge protective action in situations where prevention has failed or was never tried, and to push for justice and accountability for survivors and victims. The issue that brings us together today is how to address human rights abuses in China, and not just any human rights violations, but crimes that, as Dan said, shake our conscience. Crimes against humanity and potentially genocide perpetrated by the Chinese Communist Party against the Uyghur community. Crimes perpetrated in a manner that may very well represent the future of how atrocities are committed, may change our understanding of genocide, and create even more challenges to preventing and halting these crimes. Responding to these threats will require a deep and coordinated transatlantic commitment, not just to the response to China, but globally, a commitment that in many ways remains nascent at this time to preventing mass atrocity crimes more broadly. And perhaps Ukraine may actually present an opportunity for us to advance that commitment. This issue of the Uyghurs and of China is something that is intimately felt here in Berlin and in Germany more broadly. Acknowledging, reckoning, and coming to terms with the Holocaust has been a defining feature of German society. In addition, as you all know all too well, Chancellor Scholz just returned from a trip to Asia, including China. He was the first Western leader to visit China since the start of the pandemic, the brutal crackdowns on Hong Kong, heightened threats against Taiwan, and during COVID, the release of government documents detailing the mass detention on incredibly dubious grounds of the Uyghur community. And of course, for the first time, a visit since Xi Jinping solidified his continued rule for a third term. The visit coincided with and further accelerated self-reflection within German policy circles over what the policy towards China should be, and I look forward to the panel conversation in that regard. The approach taken by many Western governments, including by former Chancellor Merkel, that trade would somehow lead to a change in norms and promote liberalization in China has largely been debunked. This is reflected in the discussions around the need for a new China strategy by the EU, here in Germany and elsewhere. What is particularly concerning is that China's trade competitiveness has increased, and today China has supplanted the US as Germany's largest trading partner. All at the same time, China has remained a threat to a rule-based system, a world order that Germany and others rely on and value so deeply. Today, as Germany seeks to relinquish its reliance on Russia for energy, many are saying that this is a moment to truly acknowledge the nature of the Chinese government, and especially its leader, and that what is needed is increased independence from China. These same calls are being made in the US, Canada, and elsewhere. As we sit at this juncture of what might be a geopolitical pivot, how do we situate concerns about human rights in the broader understanding of our national security interests? I have to start by confessing that I don't have firm answers. What I do hope to do is provide a context for our discussion, and also critically to amplify the voices of the Uyghur community who China has for so long sought to silence. Individuals like Siba Murat, who for 4 years has been desperately trying to find her mother and free her mother. There are hundreds of thousands of Zibas. They are the modern face of the crimes that the world vowed never again. And perhaps our failure to put a greater priority on understanding China's crimes, to be willfully blind at times, has contributed to the conundrum we're now in, including over-reliance on a power that is fundamentally at odds with many of the things that we, as like-minded states, care for. So with that in mind, I'm going to cover 2 points. One, go into more detail about the exact nature of the crimes that are being perpetrated and how that challenges our understanding of both crimes against humanity and genocide. And the second, the challenge that arises when a government like China perpetrates these crimes. Part of our role, as Dan mentioned, is to act as a spotlight on communities that are often the victims of the most horrific of crimes, and that far too often there is not enough attention on, nor at times information about their plight. When Chancellor Scholz and some of Germany's most esteemed business leaders were in China for 11 hours, for each minute of their visit, Uyghur men, women, and children were being persecuted on the basis of their identity. Now, what exactly does that mean? Well, for the Uyghurs, a Muslim minority of 12 million people that reside primarily in the northwestern province of Xinjiang, that means that they spent 11 hours the way that they do every single day, under globally unprecedented electronic and human surveillance that defines their life. Or they were in a vast network of detention and re-education camps the Chinese government euphemistically calls training centers, or simply in jail, all of course without any legal recourse. Those not in detention would have walked down streets where symbols of their identity, including mosques, cemeteries, and historical sites, have been destroyed, in some cases paved over to become parking lots. They would have been careful not to wear anything that would have been seen as identifiable as Uyghur: braids, a hat, beard, a veil, for to do so would put them and their family at risk of detention. They are essentially forced to render their identity invisible. Now, the historical context of this is important to note. The Uyghurs have long suffered severe human rights violations at the hands of the Chinese Communist Party in Xinjiang, which Uyghurs call East Turkestan. The Chinese government has long sought to frame the Uyghurs as an existential threat. And this is something that we see often in situations where mass atrocities are being perpetrated. They have noted that the Uyghur community promotes what the Chinese government calls the three evils, as defined by the CCP as splitism, religious extremism, and terrorism. It is true that the desire for greater autonomy, if not outright independence, has lived on within Uyghur communities after two short-lived independent Uyghur republics in the 1930s and 1940s. In October of 1949, the People's Liberation Army troops moved into the region and created the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region. Central, since then, to the Chinese government's response has been a longstanding effort to forcibly assimilate the Uyghur community, to essentially turn them into the majority Han population. The process has included attempts since the 1950s to force a demographic change, creating incentives, including economic incentives for Han to settle in Xinjiang. This has exacerbated inequities between the two communities and contributed to grievances. There have been prohibitions on the expression of Uyghur religion and culture, and as I noted, the destruction of Uyghur religious sites. Just as one example, 1/3 of all mosques, about 8,500 mosques have been destroyed, and there have also been violent attacks against Uyghurs, including in 2009 in the capital, Urumqi. Any peaceful struggle for greater Uyghur autonomy regarding their culture, religion, language, and traditions is met with extremely harsh crackdowns, known as the Strike Hard campaign by Chinese authorities. Particularly after 9/11, China has sought to equate any desire for religious, cultural, or linguistic determination with global terrorism, vastly exaggerating or outrightly inventing threats emanating from such groups as the East Turkestan Islamic Movement, also known as the East Turkestan Islamic Party. This argument had salience for a period of time, but recognizing the strategy, the US government delisted ITIM from its terrorism list in 2020. The consequence of the Chinese efforts and the co-opting of the language of the war on terror has been the dehumanization of the Uyghur community in the eyes of other Chinese, and they're being regarded internally as a threat. What also has to be acknowledged is the subjugation of the people also overlaps with the economic interests of the Chinese Communist Party. The Belt and Road Initiative aims to link over 60 countries. 3 of the 6 economic corridors essential to the plan pass through Xinjiang. A major economic hub is also planned for the border of Xinjiang and Pakistan. This is a $1 trillion project, and controlling Xinjiang's population is key to its success. It's also worth noting that a rail hub in Duisburg, Germany, is a key node in the transportation network for shipping of Chinese goods. Now, I talked a lot about a policy of forced assimilation. What became particularly concerning for us as an institution and merited the work that we have undertaken over the last few years is what began to happen after 2016, when Xinjiang received a new party secretary, Shen Xuanzhu. He came to Xinjiang from Tibet, where he had advanced repressive policies there, including mass arrests, the use of mass detention camps, and a new level of electronic surveillance. After his transfer to Xinjiang, we saw a dramatic change in conditions within Xinjiang and an evolution of the tactics used that moved our concerns from one of forced assimilation and raised the specter of genocide. In particular, since 2017, these horrific violations have included forced sterilization, torture, sexual violence, and forced labor. Now, I know many of you have probably read articles about Xinjiang or read articles about the kind of surveillance state. I know it sounds very Orwellian, but it's not fiction. It's the reality that's lived by 12 million people. By 2016, Uyghurs needed passbooks to travel within Xinjiang. In some cases, many of them were not allowed to leave their hometowns. Many had their passports taken, prohibiting their ability to leave the country. Building on the tactics used in Tibet, Chen placed police and paramilitary troops every few hundred feet in Xinjiang's main towns. It is impossible for a Uyghur person to walk down a street in the capital and many other cities without having their movements tracked by high-tech surveillance. Messaging apps are monitored. Phones have surveillance software placed on them. Cars owned by Uyghurs have got tracking GPS devices implanted within them. Even more unnerving is biometric information is taken without any consent, and in some cases, DNA samples have been taken as well. The high surveillance system that's used is married by in-person surveillance, the placing of Han Chinese into Uyghur families. Reports suggest that over 200,000 Han were sent to Xinjiang for this purpose as part of a program called Visit the People, Benefit the People, and Bring Together the Hearts of the People. Now imagine what this means in practice. You have a stranger living in your home, checking to see if you pray, how you dress, what you discuss, where you go. Not using your front door is reason enough to be reported as unusual behavior. You can imagine the impact on families, and you can also imagine the risk, including for sexual violence, which is incredibly high. What this dual surveillance process, referred to as a joint operation platform, creates is essentially a pipeline for detention. The US government believes that between 1 to 3 million Uyghurs have been detained. As of 2020, there are believed to be 300 to 400 detention centers. Leaked police files show that people have been detained for things like wearing traditional clothing, praying, and other outward expressions of Uyghurness, or for doing things that could be seen by the Chinese government as suspicious, like having ties with foreigners. Now, when we released our report in November of 2021, what we focused on was our concern around the shift from a policy of assimilation to potentially one of annihilation. And the reason that we were so concerned was because of some of the reports that had been documented and were emerging about the deepening assault on women's reproductive capacity through forced sterilization and forced IUD placement, as well as the separation of men and women, forcible transfer, and of course that is linked heavily to the use of forced labor, with the Uyghurs being sent to factories throughout China, and also the reports of children being transferred to orphanages. There's an EU report that suggests that up to 880,000 Uyghur children whose parents are in detention have been taken and placed elsewhere within China. The Chinese government's treatment of the Uyghur population has dehumanized the group and created an environment where we believe genocidal ideology can take root. Now, we know that the government has persecuted multiple groups in China. It is the scale and the severity of the assault on the Uyghurs that is unprecedented. And that is what has led us as an institution to believe that the Chinese government may be committing genocide against the Uyghur community. This is in addition to our finding that there's a reasonable basis to believe that the Chinese Communist Party has perpetrated the crimes against humanity of persecution and imprisonment and other severe deprivation of physical liberty and forced sterilization, sexual violence, enslavement, torture, and forcible transfer. That's virtually every crime against humanity that exists. The US Department of State, under both the Trump and Biden administration, has declared that China's actions against the Uyghurs and other Turkic Muslim communities constitutes genocide and crimes against humanity. And it's worth meriting just a quick note, because many people focus primarily on the crime of genocide. In Nuremberg, both crimes were prosecuted. The majority of the Nazis' crimes were prosecuted as crimes against humanity. And we often try to remind people of that because of the fact that the severity of both crimes and the impact of both crimes is such that we don't feel that there needs to be a hierarchy of acknowledging the crimes that have occurred. Many of you know that when we talk about genocide, genocide focuses on the intent to destroy a people in whole or in part. And there are a number of different acts that could be constitutive of genocide. Includes the killing of members of a group, causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of a group, deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole and part, imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group, and forcefully transferring children. Now, when many of us think of genocide, we tend to think of mass killing. We tend to think of contexts like Rwanda, contexts like the Holocaust. That conception of genocide rests very much on biological destruction. And what is happening in China raises a number of questions for us about the commission of genocide and also what the future commission of genocide may look like. Genocide does not require mass killing. I just kind of outlined for you the components within it. Our conception, our kind of conventional conception of genocide has at times ignored the unique threats that women and children face. They have not had the requisite attention paid towards them as victims of genocide. And in the past decade, in part because of the genocide perpetrated against the Yazidi community, of which women were intentionally targeted, children were taken, there was restrictions on birth, and then now the context of the Uyghurs, we're beginning to see, I think, a more appropriate understanding of how genocide could potentially be committed. Women and girls are the focus of genocidal perpetrators. Specific strategies are developed to target them. This often falls into the category of acts that are not, as I said, mass killing, acts of sexual violence, acts on their reproductive capacity, either through rape or forced pregnancies with the aim of bearing children who do not share the same identity. I did a lot of work in northern Iraq. There was an intentional targeting of Yazidi women for forced pregnancies. The children that were born would not be perceived by the community as being Yazidi. This was an intentional strategy by the self-proclaimed Islamic State. We've also seen that genocide can be committed through restricting births, both with the intention to destroy a community. China has, as many of you know, long had a restrictive policy when it comes to its reproductive policies, limiting the number of children that families can have, IUD implantations, and at times forced abortions. But the deepening assault on the Uyghur female reproductive capacity that is happening specifically at a time when China is actually reversing policies to limit births in other communities. This is really significant when we try to look at what is the intention behind the actions of the Chinese Communist Party. As of 2014, the Strike Hard campaign has focused on restricting Uyghur births, seeing high birth rates as a catalyst to splitism and extremism. And it's worth noting that in leaked government documents, having excessive birth beyond 2 children, for example, is the most frequently used justification for the detention of women, for Uyghur women. These documents also show that in 2019, in the Xinjian provincial government plans, they intended to sterilize or place IUDs in at least 80% of women of childbearing age in 4 prefectures where the Uyghur population is most concentrated. The consequence of that? In Hotan County in southern Xinjiang, where the population is 90% Uyghur, they saw a 70.8% drop in the birth rate recorded between 2012 and 2018. In 2019, at least 186,000 fewer children were born in Xinjiang, compared with what would have been expected if birth rates had maintained at the same level. Now, these were government documents that were released. It was statistical reports that were released annually. Worth noting that they are no longer published publicly. It's not the first time that we've seen actions like this. We often forget that in the Holocaust, one of the first crimes to be committed was the forced sterilization of women deemed undesirable due to race and religion. When we look at sexual violence, also in the context of the Holocaust, it took decades for survivors and researchers to raise these crimes. In some cases, it still remains taboo today to discuss, often because of societal stigma and trauma, and as a result, they were not included in the prosecutions in Nuremberg. But the scale of what's occurring now and the surveillance technologies used to facilitate them are new. These are strategies that can be easily exported by those who seek to repress or destroy a people with little trace. These types of crimes are incredibly difficult to expose. There are no mass graves or bodies to be photographed, shared around the world, and to mobilize mass outcries. In a closed society where travel is restricted and where even speaking to a foreigner or someone outside of China can lead to your being detained, and Uyghurs living outside of China being harassed regularly, it's very difficult for people to both escape and for the few who have to share their stories. Now, even though China limits access to the region, that does not mean that they're totally able to hide their crimes. And as I've just articulated, we feel that we have enough information for us as an institution to be very concerned both about the commission of crimes against humanity and genocide. The information that we know is damning, and we know that with crimes against humanity and risk of genocide, it does trigger a legal obligation for states to take action to prevent and halt genocide, as well as, of course, the international community's responsibility to protect victims of genocide and crimes against humanity. And as many of you might recall, Germany was a strong supporter of the responsibility to protect. So after kind of examining the horrors that are the crimes that are occurring, and of course, the focus primarily on women as the primary targets of the perpetration of this particular crime, the question then is what to do. And I'm hoping that the panel is going to be able to help identify opportunities and ways to influence the Chinese government to change their behavior. We know that perpetrators go to extreme lengths to hide and deny the nature of their crimes. And as we've said, that Xinjiang is largely inaccessible. The Chinese government has been truly exemplary in their efforts to try to hide the crimes, to dismiss the concerns. They've restricted access to the detention centers and prisons where millions of people who they are persecuting live. But we can't say that we don't know. And as I've mentioned already, in the work that we do, we rely on the testimonies of survivors, we rely on leaked government information, and a host of other sources to help inform our particular findings. One would hope that the information would lead to a swift and coordinated global action to halt and prevent these crimes. And obviously what is most clearly needed is for the Chinese government itself to immediately halt the commission of these crimes. But there's no signs that they will voluntarily do so. And when we think about how to prevent mass atrocities, and when we think about the traditional toolbox and how one approaches the phenomenon of tackling mass atrocities, we tend to look at it from a couple of different perspectives. And that helps to identify what the policy options could be. So in a situation like this, what we would look to do is, one, degrade the capacity of perpetrators to commit further atrocities. This can look like imposing deterrent measures such as additional sanctions and import restrictions, which have been done. Examples of specific actions with the potential to degrade perpetrator capacity include financial sanctions targeting commercial entities that are supporting China's repressive policies, export controls on advanced technologies, and the creation of targeted technologies to jam or disable the technology being used to facilitate atrocities, including the surveillance systems. ensuring that businesses do not rely on the use of forced labor. A second strategy would be to persuade perpetrators to stop committing atrocities. For example, restrictions on Chinese imports to the United States exact cost on the Chinese economy that the government may wish to avoid. Publicizing the atrocities, enacting financial sanctions, visa bans on Chinese officials responsible for them, and imposing political and reputational costs. The jury's out on whether or not this is having an impact. One thing that is worth noting is that at least the US government is also exploring whether or not there is avenues for domestic prosecutions for those who may be involved in enabling the commission of mass atrocity crimes. A third strategy would be to protect Uyghurs who are outside of China. For example, countries can expedite refugee protections for Uyghurs who have fled China. And of course, a fourth strategy that we focus a lot on is promoting justice and accountability. Dedicating resources to the collection and analysis of information regarding ongoing atrocity crimes and the risk of future mass atrocities, including information on changes in birth rates. This requires innovative strategies to get information out, and promoting accountability through the creation of things like independent, impartial, investigative mechanisms to collect, preserve, and analyze evidence. Now, the challenge of changing China's behavior is enormous. The CCP is a perpetrator that's shown significant resources to both continue perpetrating crimes and has shown that it can spend significant energy thwarting efforts to document crimes or promote accountability. One could argue that if these crimes were being committed by an array of other governments, we would have likely seen more of an outcry and more of a coherent strategy, even just within the United Nations system. Many of you will have seen that it took months for the former High Commissioner to release a report on Xinjiang. She released it 2 hours before the end of her term. Not exactly a portrait of courage. Now, when we think about the challenges, just in wrapping up, the first challenge is that in the context of China, there are diverse, sometimes competing national interests within and among like-minded countries regarding relations with China. That's an obvious statement. We know that there are interests that range from trade to East Asian security to climate change and beyond. What is worth noting is that at least in the context of the United States, President Biden and other US presidents have reiterated that atrocity prevention is a core national security interest that should be regarded on parallel with others. Unfortunately, in the latest national security strategy, there is no mention of atrocity prevention. And notably, addressing crimes against Uyghurs has not been prominently prioritized in any nation's national security policy. It's also worth underscoring that no other government than the United States actually has an atrocity prevention strategy, nor has articulated that preventing these crimes is part of their national security interest. The failure to do this and to signal this as a priority undermines opportunities for coordinated action, the allocation of dedicated resources to atrocity prevention. And given the scale of the crimes and unique challenges posed by China, there needs to be a coordinated global effort to confront these crimes. The second, of course, is the difficulty in convincing China to change its behavior. China's growing economic, military, and political strength makes it easier for them to rebuff calls for change, dismissing them as interference in Chinese internal affairs, and more difficult for external actors to build broad coalitions and find effective points of leverage. This is going to require creativity on all of our parts and also the inclusion of not just state actors, but also those within the private sector to find innovative strategies and ways to leverage positions, build coalitions to engage the Chinese government. One of the things that is particularly worrying, and especially with the continuation of Xi Jinping's power, is that we may very well be seeing a continuation or potentially a deepening of current policies, including those towards Xinjiang, and even changes in the party leadership within Xinjiang, and the appointment of a new party secretary has not resulted in any change in behavior, any release of individuals who are being detained, any announcements of who is being held, or changes in terms of any of the restrictions that are placed on the Uyghur community. And then, of course, as I noted before, just the very nature of these crimes, the fact that we do not have images of mass killing makes it very easy for the Chinese to come back and really counter the allegations and to allege that what they are doing is not as nefarious as what I have outlined and what other experts have detailed is going on. And so I'm hoping that both the ambassador and Noah are going to be able to speak a little bit more about what this should mean for Germany. As we noted at the beginning, this is a moment potentially for a pivot point. Many of your officials have gone on the record, including the foreign minister, being both vocal about the need to change the business as usual approach to engaging with China. This has been echoed in the context of the EU, and increasingly we see concerns about the Belt and Road Initiative and what that might mean, as do we with the use of electronic surveillance technologies, Huawei, 5G, and the such. So I think we're at a moment where we're going to need to collectively be creative, where our traditional means of influence have not had the desired effect. We have seen certain strategies, including focusing on forced labor, trying to identify and have a rebuttable presumption that if anything is being produced in Xinjiang, if the cotton that you're wearing, if the tomatoes that you're consuming are coming from Xinjiang, one should assume that they are being produced as a result of forced labor. The US has legislation now that essentially does that. The EU has been looking at similar. That perhaps might be something that could have more of an impact. But what we do know is that we need to ensure that the prevention of mass atrocities is not relegated as a tier 2 priority, that this really is understood as core to national security interests, and that we work together as a group of collective like-minded states to develop a strategy to prevent and halt the crimes that the Chinese government are committing. The failure to do so is going to have long-lasting consequences, not just for the Uyghur community itself, but for the fraying international order. And I think we're seeing that all too clearly today. So just in closing, as an institution, we understand intimately that those who perpetrate crimes wreak profound harm on the immediate victims, their communities, and set in motion trauma that can cascade down through multiple generations. Germany is one of the largest community of Uyghurs. These are people who are suffering on a daily basis. They do not know where their loved ones are. The pain is deep and wide. The Chinese government has sought to eliminate the culture and soul of the Uyghur community, and today we are very concerned that they're seeking to eliminate them as a people. And while there have been important steps taken, such as the example of the Uyghur Forced Labor Act that I just referenced, it hasn't been sufficient. So I'm hoping that through this conversation today, we're going to be able to hopefully find some rays of hope. And I think it's also, and I can say this just in hindsight since the trip already happened, it's a reminder that we have to be very, very careful in how we frame even what has been portrayed as day trips. They can be perceived as rewarding a regime that is only with each day becoming more repressive towards its people and destructive to the international order. US President Joe Biden said at an International Holocaust Remembrance Day that preventing future genocide remains both a moral duty and a matter of national global importance. My question is that only true when there's no other competing interests at hand? German Chancellor Scholz said in response to the Ukraine that we're at a turning point. The world after is no longer the same as the world before. My question in that context, is that only true when we can see the people being killed? What about when millions are being silently erased? Thank you very much.
Amy, why don't you sit there? Volker, Noah. All right. Naomi, thank you for a riveting and horrifying and comprehensive review of the issue at hand. I want to introduce our panelists right now. I'm delighted to welcome Volker Stanzel, who served as German ambassador to the People's Republic of China from 2004 to 2007. He achieved the notable diplomatic double of also being the German ambassador to Japan from 2009 to 2013. Today, Volker is an executive board member and senior distinguished fellow at Stiftung Wissenschaft und Politik, the German Institute for International and Security Affairs. He has been a visiting professor in many different distinguished institutions. Volker, I'm delighted that you can join us today. Noah Barkin is visiting senior fellow at the German Marshall Fund and its Asia program based here in Berlin, and he specializes on Europe's relationship with Germany and the implications of China's rise for the transatlantic relationship. If you don't know it already, you should get his newsletter, which is must-reading on the subject, and I think uniquely comprehensive. Noah is also managing editor of the China practice at the Rhodium Group, where he coordinates the group's editorial and strategic outreach on China and contributes to the firm's research. He's a journalist by training. He has been bureau chief, regional editor, roving European correspondent for Reuters, and lived in Berlin, Paris, London, and New York, not too shabby. And he has written for The Atlantic, the New York Times, Foreign Policy, and Politico, and is called upon by reporters from many, many other places. He has been a visiting fellow at the Mercator Institute for China Studies in Berlin and the American Institute for Contemporary German Studies in Washington. So thank you both for joining us. I thought that I would start out with Volker, who I'm hoping that both of our panelists will give us a few minutes of thoughts on what Naomi has said and on the current policies and policy orientation of Germany and Europe and the West in general towards China with regard to the persecution of the Uyghurs. Volker, why don't you start?
Yeah, thanks, Dan. First, thanks to the American Academy for bringing Naomi here, and thanks to Naomi for your impressive, if depressing presentation. I hope you have a lot of interlocutors while you're here in Germany to whom you can talk the way you did to us today. On the subject matter, I think two aspects are worth mentioning. One is, against the backdrop of especially we in Germany being very, very careful with making a comparison of any genocide with the Holocaust genocide. Yet, in one particular aspect, it is quite instructive. The Nazis were believers in what, since the 19th century, was an accepted scientific theory, that is race theory, which meant that you made a difference, you thought there'd be a difference in capacities, mental capacities between different races, which then led to the Nazis' conclusion that there are certain races which deserve nothing better than being slaves, and others which do not even deserve to live, with the result that we all are aware of. Now, if you look at the genocide that Naomi has just explained in great detail that occurs in Xinjiang, I think it is extremely interesting that there's nothing like the traditional race theory in the reasoning of the Chinese when they explain what they're doing. It is, if anything, it is a theory of cultural superiority. Xi Jinping himself said at various times, "We are all children of the Yellow Emperor." Now, who is this all? It means anyone who lives on territory that at some point in the relatively recent past was conquered by the People's Liberation Army and included into the territory of the People's Republic of China. Now, if anyone who lives in that territory acquired by armed force is deemed a child of the Yellow Emperor, then that means he can be subject to any kind of treatment, whatever the Communist Party deems right. And this is an enormous difference which has consequences. If you compare it to the genocide that was committed with the Holocaust, it is something that I would call social engineering. You have changed already all the people who belong to the Manchu ethnic group to become Han Chinese. There's hardly anyone in northeastern China who speaks even the Manchu language anymore. In so-called Inner Mongolia, that's the part of Mongolia that's governed by the People's Republic, you have, I believe, 18% of the people who still even only speak Mongolian. And if you look at smaller minorities, or of course at the Tibetans, you can speak of something like cultural genocide almost in every instance. It is a kind of social engineering, which also the Communist Party submits the Han ethnic group to. It is just the way of governing. And that is, I think, why that is the consequence I mentioned. That is why it is so difficult to rally people internationally in order to bring the Chinese government to change its ways. First, of course, you have a lot of authoritarian governments who are envious of the capabilities of the Communist Party in China in social engineering, who buy their electronic surveillance systems, etc. You have all that. You have support, actually, for the way the Chinese government handles these problems. Secondly, it has become so much a topic of governance that not even the question is anymore, are these Muslims or are these Chinese, which plays a role in international discussions, which leads to what we all observe, that when this topic is discussed in the Human Rights Council in Geneva, you always have a majority of votes supporting the Chinese point of view. It does not seem like a mass atrocity, to use your term, Naomi. It doesn't seem at all like that. It is just, well, what we do. What we do, I mean, not all, but many governments in the world do or would like to do in the same way the Chinese Communist Party does it. So this makes it extremely difficult. It is maybe easy in democratic countries to have a presentation like yours, or research like you did it, Naomi. But to go one step further, meaning to internationalize the topic, is extremely difficult. And that's the second aspect I wanted to mention. I mean, in Germany, from next year on, we have the supply chain law, which requires companies to look and to make sure that products they buy anywhere in the world are produced according to human rights and environmental standards that are those of Germany. But that is just one country, and then other EU countries and the United States. But it's not something that the majority of countries in the world cares about. That is the reason why it's so difficult to really come to a conclusion, a sensible conclusion, how to deal with this problem. Yes, you may say mass atrocity prevention is a part of security policy, but that is true only in very few countries. And what is necessary in the case of an enormous crime like the one we are confronted with in Xinjiang, and as I said, not just in Xinjiang, also in Tibet and other parts of China, confronted with a challenge like that, the only way out I can see is to really internationalize the problem. And that is an enormous challenge, an enormous task. But without that, I'm afraid we can talk, we can have minor legislative changes like this global supply chain law, but we will not really have an impact on the way the Communist Party behaves in Xinjiang and other parts to its own people, because once again, the way Communist Party treats the Uyghurs is basically the same it treats its own Han ethnic people. Like, thank you.
Noah, some thoughts.
Yeah. Well, first of all, thanks for having me, and Naomi, thanks for your comments, and yours, Volker. I perhaps will start with a bit of context because I focus on Germany's relationship with China, on Europe's relationship with China, and I think it's important to talk about where we've come from, where we are, to help put this in context. Naomi mentioned it in her remarks. I think we're coming from a decade or more where German policy was very much focused on economic engagement with China. I think China was seen largely through the prism of the Chinese market. It was a lucrative one-way bet for German companies. And human rights issues were pushed to the side. Now, I think that changed in the final years of the Merkel era, when I think what we were seeing in Xinjiang and also in Hong Kong towards the end was impossible for the government to ignore. But Merkel suffered a number of setbacks at the end of her term, 16 years in office, on issues like 5G, on issues like she tried to push through this comprehensive agreement on investment between the EU and China that is now in the deep freeze, in part because of sanctions related to Xinjiang. But the new government came in promising a different approach. The Greens, who are sitting in the foreign ministry and the economy ministry, talked about a values-based foreign policy when they, during the election campaign. The coalition agreement that they sealed with the Social Democrats and the Free Democrats talks about Xinjiang, talks about Hong Kong, and other issues like Taiwan. So this is positive. The rhetoric I believe, is shifting. We saw Scholz during his trip to China talk openly about Xinjiang. We've seen Annalena Baerbock, the foreign minister, raising this issue with her Chinese counterpart. We saw the economy minister, Robert Habeck, deny Volkswagen government investment guarantees related to its investments in Xinjiang, which still has a plant there, along with a number of other German companies who were on the trip with Scholz, by the way. Volker talked about the supply chain due diligence law. We also have a supply chain due diligence law, which is in the pipeline in Brussels at the EU level. Brussels came out with a proposal on a forced labor ban a couple months ago. But things are moving very slowly, and it's mainly, I think, a rhetorical shift that we're seeing. Germany did support, for example, in September, the push, or maybe it was in October, the push for a discussion within the UN Human Rights Council on Xinjiang. That was defeated narrowly, but all European countries supported that, apart from Ukraine, which I think had its own reasons for not wanting to anger China. But this is a slow rhetorical shift, and when I look at the current situation in Germany, I think the broader foreign policy situation is quite precarious because Germany relied on essentially three pillars over the past decades in the Cold War period, post-Cold War period. It was U.S. security, China for trade and investment, and Russia for cheap energy. Now, Russian energy has fallen by the wayside. We're seeing cracks in, I think if anyone's looking at the US midterms are being held today, if anyone's looking what is coming out of some of the Republican side on investment, on continued military support for NATO and all that, we saw Donald Trump vacillate on that. All the pillars are either showing cracks or crumbling. So Germany is in a very precarious situation. I think it needs to reinvent itself economically. Unfortunately, I don't see a major leap forward on human rights at a time like this. I think the Greens have been pushing for this, but the government, let's face it, is quite divided. We saw that on the Schultz trip, and we can get into that in a bit more depth. But I'll stop there.
Okay. Naomi, we'll come back to you in just 1 minute, but I wanted to follow up on these two statements. Volker, let me push you a little. Internationalization is obviously required, but I wonder if internationalization, if the requirements of internationalization wouldn't be met by genuinely active engagement by Europe and North America, which after all constitute a huge part of China's export markets. It is true that the world is now sorting itself between those who don't like being pushed around by the West and those who want to be associated with the West. And there is therefore a lot of sympathy for China's resistance to human rights claims from Europe and the U.S. But don't you think that it would be a big start if we could simply overcome what Noah, I think, has accurately referred to as a largely rhetorical position?
Well, the law that I mentioned and that Noah also mentioned will be in force next year. So this is happening. It's happening in other countries. I don't know where in Europe aside from Germany, but I believe a number, and the EU is pushing that too. And the same is happening in the United States. The point I wanted to make is that this is not enough.
Right.
I mean, okay, it's fine and good, and Volkswagen will protest and will suffer for it, presumably, and so will other companies. And it's a important act, but it is more or less symbolism. It doesn't go beyond that. And internationalization, of course, is a tall order. I mean, even if one large country invades a small one, then you only get 141 votes at the United Nations, more than 50 lacking to condemn that. It is a difficult job to get a sizable majority together, even if the issue is mass atrocities. So Naomi spoke about transatlantic coordination here. Absolutely right. And that is a start. Let's get our act in the EU together and then get it together with the United States. But that can only be first and second steps.
No, why don't you talk a bit about how you think the Chancellor's trip went? The Chancellor published an op-ed in the Frankfurter Allgemeine, essentially saying he was going to talk about all the big issues. I believe Uyghurs were not one of the ones that was mentioned. He did talk about them in his statement afterwards, which I'm sure aggravated the Chinese to no end. Why don't you give us your view of the trip, the timing, the optics, the group?
Well, I mean, I'm of the view that it's not reasonable to expect the German Chancellor not to talk with the I've done a double negative there, but it's okay for Schultz to speak with Xi. China is the second biggest economy in the world. I think one has to engage with a country like China. I think the problem with this Scholz trip is, one, the timing. So soon after the party congress, Scholz is going to see Xi in Bali at the G20 summit in mid-November, a week from today. And I think, instead of making a special one-day trip out to Beijing to see Xi after he's been confirmed as leader for life in China, the optics of that, he could have seen him at the G20 summit and then gone to Beijing at a later date. So I think the timing wasn't very well thought out. I think the decision to bring a business delegation with him, 12 companies, is problematic, especially at a time when his government is working on a new China strategy, which will be unveiled next spring, which focuses on reducing German economic dependencies on China. So Germany's close economic ties with China, which I think for many years were seen as a real strength, are now seen increasingly as a vulnerability. And I think the other problematic thing about this trip is that Scholz, and this may be the most problematic of all, is that Scholz pushed through this deal by a Chinese shipping company, COSCO, for a stake in a container terminal in the Hamburg port just about a week before going. And Chinese diplomats had been warning the German government against vetoing this deal. 6 of his ministers opposed it. The intelligence agencies opposed it. The European Commission issued an opinion saying it was problematic. This is a confidential opinion, but this is what people tell me. So this looked like a gift to Xi. I think Scholz did raise many of the issues that he needed to raise while he was in Beijing. So that is positive. But I think we also saw, for example, there was a tweet by the Chancellor's Twitter account. I don't know who sent it, but it was based on some comments that he made in his joint press conference with Li Keqiang, the Chinese premier, which said China and Germany share values of reliability and trust, and this can be a basis for political partnership. To me, that's probably the wrong message to send when the atrocities that are happening in Xinjiang are going on. So I think the Chancellor is still working through his China policy. My view is that there's a bit of a learning curve there, and we'll have to see how this develops. But the good thing is that there are people within the German government now who see it differently and are pushing back against that.
And Volker, as someone who has been inside the factory, why don't you give us your thoughts on the trip and how the different issues were handled?
Yeah, administrative tainted point of view, but I'd say I agree to a high degree with Noah, but it's a qualified agreement. First, I think the timing was unavoidable. Scholz obviously did not want to go too early to China because of this whole dependency argument that we all know. However, he could not go much later because in protocol terms, his counterpart is the Prime Minister, Li Keqiang of China, and that one is on his way out. And he will leave his post in March in Nationalist People Congress. So the later you go, the more he is really only a lame duck. Or you wait until sometime summer next year, which between partners that you have correctly described. I mean, it's our most important trading partner. Germany is the leading country in Europe as far as relationship with China is concerned. To wait 1.5 years after taking office, that's too long. So to use the moment when Xi Jinping was re-elected as General Secretary to say, okay, great, these are our concerns, and now let's go on with business. I think that is a sensible idea. However, I find it unfortunate that Scholz managed to spoil the whole impression of that trip. And you have mentioned a number of points. I mean, the Costco thing, to take that decision right before taking the trip is such a skillless kind of procedure that it is, it does look like a gift, and an unnecessary gift at that. Secondly, I said the most important partner of China in Europe is Germany, and China is our most important trading partner. Yes, but Germany is also a leading country in Europe. And Scholz managed to travel in a way that it looked he only went as the German chancellor. He didn't go as a European. When Macron was visited by Xi Jinping a while ago, he invited Chancellor Merkel to join him and a representative from the European Union. Would it have done a great damage had Macron come along as he wanted to come along, or a representative of the European Union? It would have shown the Chinese, it would have shown the Europeans and the Americans, the new German chancellor is a European politician, and he stands up for Europe. He only went there to do business as usual. And if you look at the op-ed he wrote in the Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung, you read it and you think, is the ghostwriter still the same who wrote for Miss Merkel? It's so unfortunate. There was an opportunity, and the opportunity was lost. And now it looks, bottom line, like we have a chancellor who doesn't really concern himself with China. It's like China's still a blank for him. He does it, okay, he went there because it had to be, but he is not really into the China business. That's the problem of the other ministries that you mentioned, and probably we'll go and see some controversies there in the future.
And maybe I can just add one quick point. I agree absolutely with Volker that this was very unfortunate because Scholz left behind a sort of scorched earth in Berlin, in Europe. Scholz and Macron are now clearly divided on how to approach China, and within the G7. And I think, and this coming back to the internationalization of the Xinjiang issue, I think sway with China depends on a united front in Berlin, a united front in Europe, and a united front at the G7 or broader international level. And I think, I'm not saying Scholz single-handedly torpedoed all three, but I think we're pretty close to that with this trip. It was a missed opportunity, as Volker said.
I want to ask Naomi one question, then we'll open it up to the audience. Naomi, perhaps in the best Chinese tradition, we should also engage in a little self-criticism, hearkening back to the Cultural Revolution, if you will. So the first allegation of mass atrocity, really genocidal behavior, was done on the last day of the Trump administration. And it was widely reported that this was just essentially a concession to Secretary Pompeo, then Secretary of State Pompeo, and perhaps also an effort to erase the reporting in which then President Trump had told Xi Jinping that the detention camps were just the right thing to do. So that certainly was not an ideal rollout. And then the issue came up again in the context of the presidential campaign, in which then candidate Biden was very forward-leaning on the issue. And when he came into office, the State Department reaffirmed essentially what the previous administration has said. We are a long way from being so concerned about allegations of genocide in the way that we were wrapped around the axle, if you will, before Rwanda. In other words, this is more of a toss it out the window approach as you go by. And I'm wondering if there's anything more you can tell us about what the U.S. is doing on this account to make this a really serious issue.
Yeah, no, thanks for that. And I appreciate just kind of the giving a little bit of the context of what transpired in the US. I think it is worth just noting that always, anytime the US government makes a genocide determination, it's generally a messy thing. And that's because you see the kind of challenge of legal analysis marries political decisions, and one trumps the other, or sometimes they're informed by each other. And I think you saw that play out. I think there is a kernel of consistency, though. I think that Matt Pottinger, when he was in the Trump administration and doing his role as Deputy National Security Advisor, was always very clear-eyed about the Chinese Communist Party, Xi Jinping. And for him, there was not, and I just point to this as an example, the tension between understanding that what was happening to the Uyghurs and Xinjiang was representative of broader threats and challenges that the Chinese government posed to the international order. He intimately saw those as interwoven and was very much involved in framing a US policy approach to China that in many ways stands today. And that has a much more kind of multifaceted understanding of threats, including what we've talked about, technology, overdependence, and trade. And so it was during that tenure that we really saw, including within Congress, a ramping up of looking at what are strategies and avenues to influence, with a large focus on the issue of forced labor, and really trying to also examine where are US corporate interests invested in a way that could potentially be problematic in the long term, dual use technologies, for example, trying to find creative ways to go after that, putting out business advisories, which the US government does not do often, but a business advisor essentially warning businesses who are doing business in Xinjiang about what the possible implications could be. So there's been a real desire to, I think, take a strategy that isn't very different than, when I looked at the coalition treaty and what they articulated around having kind of a China policy, figuring out the slightly longer term vision of reducing dependency, improving US domestic capacity. There are, of course, very, very hard issues, things like reliance on China for rare earth minerals and things along those lines, but figuring out how to invest in more quickly creating greater independence, less trade reliance, while at the same time finding strategies to elevate attention on the human rights issues. And I don't know if that's always been done in the most effective ways. And I think that both prongs require, again, that much more coordinated transatlantic strategy, working together to come up with one common policy on some of the trade issues, how to come up with a more comprehensive system when you are sanctioning Chinese government entities that are doing business in Xinjiang, things like cotton, when you are looking at the forced labor, ensuring that those legislations within the EU, Germany, the US align. But similarly, when you're looking at more of the kind of traditional human rights avenues, the fact that the vote in the Human Rights Council went the way it did, and that they lost 17-19 with 11 abstentions, I think unfortunately there needs to be some kind of reflection on whether or not the strategy taken was effective, whether or not the US should have been the face of taking forward that particular resolution. To have Argentina abstain, Indonesia vote against, I think it speaks a lot to what the ambassador was noting. We really have to think more carefully and in a more concerted way about how to leverage different governments' strengths when we're talking about promoting human rights, how to ensure we're more synced up when we're looking at issues related to trade, but also in how we talk about these particular issues more broadly. The fact that this is not, as the ambassador is noting, regarded as a massive threat to millions of Muslim minorities living in China, that is not part of the conversation. Indonesia, largest Muslim community, voted against it. I think is kind of a glaring example of where we need to really work on kind of figuring out how to kind of better tell the story, and maybe move this again away from just being discussed as a purely human rights issue, and frame it more as rule of law. I mean, the one thing ironic to the tweet that was said before, on what was it, reliable and trust? Yeah, what's reliable is China is going to continue to govern the way that it is, and we can trust that they're going to continue to do that. So, reversing that, I think we just have to start kind of working out, is that the world order that you want? Is that what you want in terms of rule of law? And I think it can't be done with each country coming up with its own independent strategy. And I thought what was articulated in the coalition treaty was a very sound approach, but we have to recognize the change on the trade side is going to take a very long time. And for Uyghurs today who are facing threats, they need to see more rapid action.
Okay. We are a little low on time, but let's gather 2 or 3 questions for our panelists, perhaps, and work through those. Right there, we only have one question right now.
Yeah, hello. So I don't think you have really said anything of substance yet. So I wanted to ask you, so there's basically a lot of things the EU could do, like sanctions, limiting access of Chinese firms into the EU. They could force own companies to get out of China, like not only Volkswagen, but also BASF has a huge production plant in the Xinjiang region. But with the position of moral superiority, which the EU is promoting right now, I don't feel they're actually willing to sacrifice part of their prosperity just in order to actually enforce anything. Because you have said many times now, it's difficult, internationalization is a difficult process. But can you please elaborate on what actually should be economically done? Because I don't think you said anything of worth, to be honest.
Who wants to take that fastball and dispatch it quickly? Yes. Or not.
Yeah, I'm sure.
I think we all can.
Yeah.
I mean, obviously, I think the EU needs to accelerate the process to create their own version of the Forced Labor Act. It's been waiting in Parliament to move forward. We've already got the discussion here about the supply chain legislation that will happen. I think there's a certain conversation, as you said, around the role of BASF, Volkswagen, and others. I do want to recognize that there are companies that have attempted to pull out of Xinjiang. The Chinese government is very deft in how they put pressure on corporations and also threaten individuals who are working, local staff and expats. So there's some nuance that has to be taken to what you do. We've seen protests happen in major Chinese cities when companies have spoken out about Xinjiang. So what I think the private sector needs to do is actually come together and develop their own coordinated strategy about how they are going to disentangle and pull out of Xinjiang. We've seen some companies do it. Now, they're not companies that necessarily have major investments. Airbnb, for example, made the decision to pull out. That's a different type of business model. But I think you rightly have put your finger on a particular area that needs to have much more attention and focus. Some of the statements that have been made over the past few years, including by leaders in Volkswagen, that they were unaware of what was happening in Xinjiang is simply nonsensical. And so there has to be greater account in that particular regard. There are, in the US context, a number of Chinese corporations which are linked to the government that are on something called an entities list. Those same types of sanctions can be created here in Germany. Ideally, it'd be created through the EU. There is a problem in coordinating sanctions just in general amongst like-minded states. And that's very true in the context of this particular issue as well. So there are things that can and should be done. I think there needs to be a very serious conversation in Germany when we look at, and we continuously hear this kind of refrain that it's the largest trading partner. Well, which sectors are most heavily invested in China and most reliant? It tends to be your automotive sector. Within the automotive sector, I think there needs to be a much more rigorous conversation about where in China are they producing? Do they need to be as active? I'm not a specialist in that particular regard, but my understanding is that German industry itself is raising serious concerns and questions about whether or not this is a viable future model. And if 1/4 of Volkswagens are being sold in China as well, there has to be, a much more thorough assessment about what future orientations certain sectors like the automotive industry needs to take, not just from the perspective of human rights, but again, I think there's a much larger risk mitigation process that has to be understood because of just the general nature of the Chinese Communist Party. But those are just a few things.
Why don't we try and grab another question? Yes, right here.
In the last years, it was well known that Arab Muslim countries like Saudi Arabia and United Arab Emirates, they have done deportation of Uyghurs back to China. Do you think there could be any way of negotiating about the full security of Uyghurs, or at least persecuting these Arab states?
I'm happy to kind of talk to that. I mean, I think unfortunately the Belt and Road Initiative, again, is something that we have to look very carefully at, especially governments such as the German government that is part of the broader network, because our support of those types of initiatives unfortunately feeds into a broader system that is used in the very countries that you were talking about, countries like Kazakhstan and elsewhere, to put pressure on those governments to do exactly what you were talking about. It is incredibly difficult, even for organizations like ourselves, to do some of the traditional interviews that we would want to do due to security concerns in neighboring countries where Uyghurs have been able to flee, because the moment that those individuals talk to anyone, there's a great chance that they may be unfortunately sent back, or that their families still in Xinjiang are detained for having spoken to anyone. So in an ideal world, yes, we'd want to develop that strategy. One of the key recommendations we take forward is for there to be an expedited process to allow for Uyghurs to seek refugee status in countries like the United States and elsewhere, of which there is a process that's underway. But unfortunately, there's very little interest in the countries that you mentioned to do that, because their reliance on China financially, economically, is just so great at this particular point. And the Belt and Road Initiative is one of the key kind of almost extractive industries that has created that dynamic. And it's really unfortunate. We would have hoped to see more allyship, especially in the Muslim countries within the OIC, to do that, and unfortunately the leadership has not been there.
Add something, because I think we shouldn't overlook the fact that there are two sides to the coin of raising the Islam, the Muslim issue. One is that the lack of interest in Islamic countries, and on the other hand, you have the suspicion that if the Chinese say, well, these are Islamic terrorists, that convinces not too few people in Western countries. We had 9/11 after all, we had terrorist attacks, etc., etc. Well, if the Chinese say these are Islamist terrorists, then there may be something to that. And that makes it hard to get public opinion on the side of countering Chinese policies in Xinjiang.
Last question over here.
Hi, I was just wondering a little bit about how folks are thinking about the United States and other parts of the West practicing what they preach as sort of what role that should play in moving forward, especially with the question of like internationalization. I'm thinking a lot in particular about problems like human rights issues in the US related to sort of mass incarceration, related to detention centers inside of the US, with undocumented folks that are sort of living, housed, have been detained there, the sort of support of Israeli occupation of Palestine as like examples of other human rights issues that I think like take away from the legitimacy of the US and other parts of the West, being able to like point fingers and rally other nations in support of issues like this.
who is eager to...
I
Go
can
ahead,
talk
Noah.
very quickly about that. I think that the U.S. Does have increasingly a credibility problem. We had 4 years of Donald Trump, and who knows what's going to happen today in the midterms and in the next U.S. presidential election. The U.S. response to 9/11, Iraq, Patriot Act, the way Muslims in the U.S. were treated. We have essentially what is a Muslim ban in the U.S., which is still in force. But I think I would say this is all true. The U.S. does increasingly have a credibility problem, and China uses this. They refer to the genocide of the Indians often in their propaganda. But I would caution against sort of likening what is happening in the U.S. to what is happening in Xinjiang, which is something that Naomi talked about it. 1 to 1.3 million Uyghurs detained. A concerted effort to wipe away an entire people. That is not happening in the U.S. Has it happened in the past? Yes, possibly. But I think we need to condemn what is happening, what is objectionable in the U.S., but not necessarily put it on an equal footing with what is happening at the moment in Xinjiang.
I fear we are out of time. I want to once again thank Naomi Kikoler for coming across the Atlantic to be with us today and for giving us a really vivid discussion of the plight of the Uyghurs and China's aggressive policies, aggressive persecution of them. I want to thank Noah Barkin and Volker Stanzel for joining this discussion. Those of you who are here, I hope you won't leave too quickly. I think we're having a reception afterward. I'm not sure where it is. It's being pointed out to me that it's over there. I just want to let you all know that the next Academy event will be on the 10th, which is going to be the lecture of fellow Jackie Murray on the idea and image of slavery, timely subject, in Plato's Phaedo. So please do join us. Check our website for the information on that, and please do register for our events. Thank you for joining us here.